Today, we have Mike Soutar on the show.
I get myself into a mindset, and the mindset is I've got £250,000 of Alan Sugar's money sitting behind me.
But let me tell you, his journey really hasn't been easy.
Nobody had ever tried to do this for magazines before. Every single one of the established publishing companies said this will never work. If we'd known how difficult it was, we'd never have done it.
In this episode, he shares his insights on how to scale businesses and achieve success.
That's the way to reach the most people, to be shared most, to be valued most.
And let me tell you, he does mean business. Without further ado, let's dive right into the conversation. Welcome once again, Mike.
Thanks so much.
You are, I guess, a mini celebrity in that. In that, millions and millions of people who have tuned in. It's been going a long while. So tell us about what it's like to be accosted in the street, I suppose, from time to time for that.
Yeah, it's for somebody who never set themselves up to be any kind of celebrity, it's always a wonderful thing, and it's always a massive novelty when it happens, and it tends to happen out of the blue as well. I mean, often I'd say I'm recognised and stopped in public, in restaurants or in the street or queuing up to buy a sausage roll in Greg's. I'd say probably about twice a week on average. The very first time it happened, I've been doing it for 12 years now. The very first time that it happened, I think I was a bit embarrassed by the whole thing, and I sort of batted it away. I was really kind of self-deprecating. And I saw the disappointment on the guy's face that had come up, and I suddenly realised kind of what it's like when you recognise somebody. Mm-hmm. It takes a bit of courage to come up and say hello, just in case you've got it wrong or whatever. And here was me kind of batting away his inquiry because of my embarrassment. And I thought, all right, actually, I've got to learn from this at that point. So rather than being a bit defensive or a bit embarrassed, I've just embraced it from that point on. And every time anybody comes up to speak to me, I really welcome it. We have a chat about the programme. They've always got questions. I'm always really happy to do that, or do selfies or whatever, because it's just a nice thing to happen during the day.
Mike, you don't seem half as intimidating now as you do on the screen. Well, what's the deal here? Is it all dramatized on TV?
No, I don't think so. I think what you see on TV is an entirely authentic version of me. I get myself into a mindset, and the mindset is I've got £250,000 of Alan Sugar's money sitting behind me, and the candidates need to get through me, because literally that's how I view the role that I play, the job that I do there. I want to make sure that the right person gets through to the funding at the end of the day. And so, if a candidate comes in front of me and they haven't taken the process sincerely enough, if what they've produced doesn't really hang together under scrutiny, then I'm going to give them a bit of a tough time. And you would expect that. If you wanted £250,000 of somebody's money, you'd expect to have to answer some fairly tough questions. And so therefore that's what I do. At the same time, I hope I do it with a small smile on my face or a twinkle in the eye, and often I will try and illustrate to somebody the errors that they may have made. And I suppose I've become well known over the years for producing some item or other from under the desk, just to illustrate it to them.
You stole that right from me just there, because I remember distinctly when you decided to buy a whole load of URLs and then present it to the candidate. That was just one of your iconic moments, really. That was brilliant. Oh,
there is a slight mischievousness at times, but to be honest, it's some of the best moments of the show, because sometimes people can't help but make themselves look like idiots, and you give some gentle encouragement towards that. But no, I love it. That's probably my favourite episode. And but let's go all the way back, because you being on that show is a culmination of an illustrious career, and so let's find out a little bit more about how it all started. What really was your into the world of work?
So I was at school in a place called Glenrothes, a town in Fife, and I was kind of all set to go to. I was in my 6th year of education. I was all set to go to some college or other. I really wanted to be a PE teacher. I loved playing rugby, and I was very active. And I just thought, how perfect is that? Then I don't ever really need to leave school. I'll just be. And my mum was an art teacher, so I was kind of, I was kind of used to the idea of working in education anyway. And actually, I applied for a place at a college called Jordan Hill in Glasgow, which at the time was the only place that taught physical education in Scotland. And they used to take on 18 new students every year. That was their intake, because that was the average number of jobs that came up in physical education in schools in Scotland on the way out, and they tried to place everybody. So I went along. I applied there. I applied also to do English at several different universities because I didn't really know what to do. And I was turned down everywhere. Is the honest answer. But around about the same time, I picked up the local paper, the Dundee Courier. So I looked at the situations vacant column, and it was for things like shepherds and foresters and all that kind of thing. I'm kind of thinking, I wonder what all these things would be like. And then there was a job ad, and it said, we're looking for editorial assistants for our teenage magazines, Jackie, Patches and Blue Jeans. And I thought, wow, this could be amazing, because when I was in 6th form, I got permission from the headmaster to launch a school magazine. There hadn't been one in the school before. So really for something to do, and again, for a bit of mischief, I'd launched this magazine, and it went really well, and I really enjoyed doing it. And I kind of thought, well, maybe I can work in magazines then. So I went along, went to DC Thomson, walked in through the door and just loved it. Loved the smell of it. Loved this in this grand old building in the middle of Dundee. And it felt a bit like school. There was something quite reassuring about it. As you walked through the corridors, there were all these magazine offices, and they looked a bit like classrooms, and the people looked quite young. And I thought, oh, this is a place I feel like I could fit in. So anyway, I got a job there. There were 9 people who were employed every 3 months, and at the end of every 3 months, they would get rid of 6 and keep 3, which kind of sounds a bit brutal and a bit boot camp. But in truth, I was 17 years old. When you're 17 years old, it doesn't really matter. Do you know what I mean? You get 3 months of, it's like having a summer job that didn't quite work out. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't ruin your life. Just go off to college, or you go and do something else. So I was absolutely determined to get to be one of the people that got the job, and I did. But what was really funny about it was, very early on, my 3rd day in the job, I got a call from Jordan Hill in Glasgow, and they said, we've got great news for you. One of our students has dropped out. You were 19th on the list, your first sub. You can come, term starts next week. And I said, nah, I'm really not interested. Thanks very much. I might apply again next year if this thing doesn't work out. So
wow.
I've yet to pick up the option.
Yeah, there we go. You never know. You might well end up being that PE teacher someday. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe not. I think the knees might have gone. So I started off, my very first job was working on a romantic fiction magazine for elderly ladies, which came out on a weekly basis, and it was published on hot metal presses. So I'm probably one of the few people that's still alive that started their career on such an old technology. And basically it was, these were on linotype machines. So, there was a case room on the top floor of the building. And that was where, guys in quite greasy overalls would create the lines of type on stones, which is what they were called. And then my job was to run up and down from the editorial office to the case room to pick up the galleys, which were these long sheets of paper with the columns of type on them. go down, proofread them, then pass them on to the next most senior person in the office. There were about 5 of us on the magazine. And then once the editor had signed it off, all the corrections, I would take them back up to the case room. And it was an education for me, because on the way back up to the case room, I would stop off in a little corner. I'd normally nip into the men's loos, and I would go into a cubicle, knock the door, and read all the galleys again, because everybody had a different colour pen. So I could see the corrections I'd made. I could then see where people had re-amended my corrections because I'd got them wrong, and I'd see all the things I'd missed. So over about 3 months, it was an education in English, in learning how to construct the English language. It was amazing.
I tell you, it's interesting as you speak there, Mike. The reoccurring theme that you talk to, one being, never wanting to get out of the education system and trying to prolong it, and being a teacher on the one hand. But as you move through, the whole role of learning and education is clearly playing such a strong, such a strong theme in your life. And I wonder, how you view the world of learning and education, or how you learn and keep up to date with things even today. What's your modus operandi there?
As well as reading things and listening to things that are kind of interesting and new and novel to me, I also try and synthesize those things in some way. So, one of the things I really, really enjoy doing is posting on LinkedIn. And when I post, my natural instinct is to try and post things which are interesting and useful. So I want to try and say something that might be eye-catching, and I want to try and draw lessons from it. And I suppose over time I've found that that's the most successful. That's the way to to reach the most people, to be shared most, to be valued most. And not that there's any prize to that at the end of the day, other than the satisfaction of thinking, brilliant, I've managed to say something I managed to take something, make people look at it in a slightly new way, perhaps, and they've taken things away. And then you get a comment that somebody says, that's brilliant, I never knew that tip, I'll use that in future. And you think, excellent, today has been a good day. So yeah, it's just the variety of stuff. I think there's probably a part of me that is conscious that I never went into further education. And so the things that I've learned kind of on my own terms, and there are some wonderful benefits to that. Because I kind of feel in control of my own brain and my own mind and how I learn things. But at the same time, I've always been really conscious that there are people who've kind of specialized and spent, years in some cases learning subjects, learning them, kind of really deeply. And I'm not sure I would ever have the patience to do that, but I've got a ton of respect for that.
Love that thought of looking to the fringes for learning. And whilst you may not have had further education, you've looked for education all the way through life. But what comes across from you, Mike, is there seems to be an innate enthusiasm, you talked about twinkling the eye, and an innate generosity in some of the comments you've made already. So an enthusiastic and generous person, where do you think that comes from?
Oh, crikey, I suppose. I've always really admired people who I've always really admired people who are able to come into a room and, I suppose, glow with that sense of possibility. Those are people I'm always really drawn to, and I suppose you adopt some of those things, don't you, as you go through. I think, I lived in I went to lots of different schools when I was growing up. Lots of different primary schools, or secondary school was just one. And lived in lots of different places. My parents moved around a lot. It was the 1970s. My dad was ambitious, and kept getting new jobs, basically, and kind of moving up the corporate ladder. And so we would move with those jobs. I'm an only child, and so it was, I think, relatively easy just to lift us up and drop us into the new place. And while I'm sure there are probably some downsides to that, because it probably gets in the way of forming long-term relationships, maybe, or knowing how to navigate the ups and downs. I mean, you kind of don't have to do that if you have a sense that you're going to be moving on in another 9 to 12 months. There are some real upsides to that as well. And so I've never felt apprehensive of walking into a new situation. I've always felt like I can walk into a room and I'll find some people to speak to, and I'll find common ground with them really quickly. So I suppose that was something which maybe kind of force developed my EQ. I think I have a good sense for how to read a room. I think I have a good sense for where somebody is, just in terms of their mood and where they are, and I don't typically misread those things. I'm quite quick at reading that stuff, and perhaps my enthusiasm is entirely authentic. It's entirely genuine. Even though there are people who have through my life gone, you surely can't be that happy about stuff all the time. But I kind of genuinely am. And I think partly though, it's because I've probably found over the years it's the best start point for anything. Like, you can get less enthusiastic if you want, but let's start at that place.
I think I love it, right? Start at high. I think that's a lovely thought in that way. I've got so many places I can go to here now, Mike. But I'm going to come on to the thought that thereafter, having done your stint in Dundee, you moved to London. And by the way, very similarly to you, lived in Scotland, moved to London now, and been here almost 2 decades. I actually think that for me, it was a pivotal move and one that was sort of, really opened up doors in many which ways. And I wonder how you saw that experience of, moving to the big smoke, as it were, and what do you think is then done for you?
I mean, it was an accident, is the first thing to say. So I was 19 years old. I was the pop editor of Jackie, teenage magazine. And as part of that job, you are sent down to, in those days, you were sent on the train from Dundee, which is where DC Thompson were, down to London to go and meet press officers and, glad hand them and maybe interview a few bands while you're down and do some photo sessions. And then at the end of a kind of a busy week, you come back with all this material and all these new contacts. So I went down with that brief, my very first London trip as the pop editor of Jackie magazine, and the very first appointment I had on the Monday morning was at Virgin Records in Kensal Rise, London. And I walked in and I went to meet the head of press. And the very first thing that she said to me was, "I've just lost a press officer. They've just resigned. You look like you'd make a good press officer. Would you like the job?" I'm not exaggerating. That's exactly what happened. So I was fairly startled by the whole thing. And I kind of went, I mean, that sounds really interesting. Tell me more about it. She said, well, the salary's £15,500 a year. I was on £3,500 in Dundee. So again, somewhat taken aback by that. And I think because I didn't say anything, I think she thought I was playing hardball. And so she said, "And I'll throw in a company car." So I said, "Yes, thanks very much." and so accepted a job. I had no idea anything to do with the job apart from I'd spoken to some press officers. I'd spoken to PRs, but I didn't know how to do the job. And a month later, I was in London. Not because I wanted to leave Scotland or Dundee, not because I was unhappy at DC Thompson. I wasn't. I loved it. But just because here was this exciting opportunity. And I was kind of the first one of my peer group to move to London. So it was, in retrospect, it was a fairly challenging time. Do you know what I mean? But again, I'm quite good at making friends quite quickly. So I sort of settled in. I found a little groove. I was terrible at the job. I mean, shocking. I was the worst press officer there's ever been. I was too scared to ask for advice because I assumed that I'd been given the job because I was going to be good at it. So I didn't want to admit that I was no good at it and knew I was no good at it. So I didn't ask for any advice. So I basically sat there tried to copy what other people were doing. I mean, I was pretty miserable at work, and nobody ever sat down with me and said, "Oh, this is what a good press officer does." And as I said, I just didn't have this. I didn't have the confidence. If that happened today, the first thing I'd do is I'd sit down with all the other people in there for a cup of coffee and say, "So, tell me. I mean, I've never done this before, as you know. How should I do this?" But I just thought if I admit that I can't, if I admit that, then they'll sack me on the spot, and I can't really afford for them to do that. So I was in the job for a year, and then eventually I did get the sack because I really was terrible. But by that time I was established, in London. I had a little social scene, and I had a place that I could live for a few months without paying any rent, in order to kind of build things up. And I had a whole contact book full of reviews editors and features editors and people who worked in newspapers and magazines and right the way across the industry. And so I became a freelance writer for a few months.
Wow, what a sliding doors moment. I mean, and then 4 or 5 times your salary, and then brilliant negotiating tactic, be dumbstruck and they think you're playing it cool.
Yeah.
It's definitely a tactic if anybody gets a chance to employ that. But what was interesting is, so you say you were miserable and terrible and got sacked and so on, which is surprising to hear now, but of course this is life's journey. But that sounded like your first wobble. Let's talk a bit about resilience. Where do you draw your resilience from? What does that look like when you're out of your depth or struggling or lacking a bit of confidence?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, when those things happen, I do 2 things. One is I go back to basics on things. Do you know what I mean? So I start to take first steps again, and I start to rebuild it. So I go backwards, first of all, and think about, so I'm struggling with the task. So because I'm struggling with the task, maybe I'm trying to write something, or maybe I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Could be anything new I'm trying to tackle. I'll go back to the basics of it and think, right, let me just think, do I understand what I should be trying to do here? Do I understand the brief? And if I don't, then I need to stop there and ask and kind of go and ask the questions of people who do understand the brief, who've either set the brief or the task. And then it's just a case of then rebuilding from scratch and just having that thing. I do most of my best thinking collectively. So I really like to surround myself with really good people who are not too judgmental, and with whom you can talk about things and you can express things. I think so many people have things kind of deep inside that they think, I'm not sure I should say this right now. What if I've got it wrong? That fear of being judged, that fear of getting something wrong, it just stops people, doesn't it? It acts as a brake on people, and they keep it inside. And so I always like to create situations where people can talk openly and express something, because as soon as you've started to say it, as soon as you started to express it, it becomes very clear whether it's right or wrong. In your head, something can sound like it makes perfect sense. But then when you say it, you suddenly realize, oh, okay, actually it's only 50% of the way there. Or actually it's never going to be anywhere there. So I'm going to come up with a new idea. But you have to create those environments. And I think in my career, the places where I've been most happy have been those ones where I've been able to set up a development environment where you try things out, you say things out loud, you realize if what you're talking about makes sense or no. You then try and make something happen. There's a time for thinking, a time for talking, and a time for doing, and trying to press those things together and truncate that process as much as possible so that you get to the output really quickly. I hate the idea. I'm allergic to the idea that ideas themselves are finite. People have that sense of, I've had all the ideas now. Do you know what I mean? There are so many new ideas. There's so many new things that you can do, that creating an environment where you can just try stuff out and test it out really quickly and fail and learn from your failures and then succeed and then learn from your successes. It's a brilliant thing for kind of knocking the ego out of you, which is a good thing. And it's a great way of developing original new thoughts and ideas. And I did that a lot in my career, particularly in magazines. You know, just invented new stuff, but invented new stuff in a very deliberate structure. So that informs when I kind of my own resilience is built, I think, from other people and spending time with other people that I like and trust and respect. And it's built from whenever I feel like I'm on thin ice somewhere, I just retrace my steps and then start again, and build my own self-confidence again in what I'm doing. And also, I believe massively in luck. I think, I've worked in enough places on enough projects with really good people to know that success is more than just hard work. It's more than just being clever. Often it's you just said yes to the right thing at the right time. You didn't know it was the right thing. You didn't know it was the right time. You could never have known that. But then when you apply the hard work and the smarts and bring you the best of yourself to them, you maximize the good luck of the opportunity that you find yourself in.
Mike, what a brilliant answer then. Some amazing insights to take away here. I love the thought of knocking the ego out of you. I think that's just great. I think all of us need to do that a wee bit more in most situations. But actually, what I want to come on to is when I was doing the research for this interview, I was watching a previous interview that you had done in and around some of your achievements in the men's magazine world. And of course, going back to my own youth where I was an avid consumer of those 500,000 publications that you were circulating each week, which was just phenomenal success that you've had. But what really struck me about that was the role of timing. Because actually, most corporates today, right? I mean, I've worked in large sort of corporate environments, and a lot of the time, they sit with product life cycles where they sit currently in maturity, right? At the end stage. And what you were really interesting to articulate was how, there was the heyday of men's magazines, and that sort of has moved on for a variety of different reasons. But actually, what struck me was that you weren't shy about the fact that actually the time had come, and the time may well have gone, or time to evolve. And I just think that was quite cool, because most people try and hold on to the past. And actually, I don't think that came across. And so I just wanted to get your take on that. And actually, when do you think is the time to sort of evolve, move on, know when something's done, and time to revitalize?
Yeah, I mean, the thing, as you said, the thing that probably made my reputation when I was in my kind of mid to late 20s, a couple of good things happened. First of all, I joined Smash Hits, which was as a writer, and that was, I joined it at its absolute height and then started to go downhill. I mean, you can almost say the day I joined was the day after the apex of its success, and then it started to go downhill. I'm sure those things aren't connected. But what happened was I went from being essentially a junior writer to a section editor to a commissioning editor to the deputy editor to the editor in about 2 years. So I was, having started magazines when I was 17, by the time I was 22, I was the editor of this massive teenage magazine. But it was going downhill. And our job was to try and reinflate this thing, which had been really big, and it taught me a really big lesson, which was the first instinct when you're on something successful and it starts to go downhill, the first inclination is to blame other people, because the success has meant that you told yourself you were the genius. The reason it's successful is because of me, us, like because we're really great. So the first thing you got to do is lose that part. The second thing, that the instinct is to just do what you were doing much more. And so that's what Smash Hits did. Smash Hits, for the first kind of year that I was there, people just tried harder to do the things that they'd done all the time. But those were the things that were turning people off. The tone of voice, their approach, things. Those were the things that had kind of gone out of fashion. So by just doing them more, you made the problem much worse. So it was a lesson about being brave when you're in an established market and doing new and innovative things and taking risks. Then, as you say, men's magazines happened, and I'd always wanted to work on a men's lifestyle magazine. And I was by that point in my mid-20s, late 20s, I suppose, and I read, men's lifestyle magazines. I read copies. I read details from the US, and all the US magazines I loved. Arena I loved, and I just always thought, God, this would be amazing. I'm in my late 20s now. I'm the editor of a teenage magazine. Do you know what I mean? I need to at some point to kind of get into a more mature job. I can't do this forever. So I always thought, well, maybe I'll get a job as a features editor on GQ or something like that. And then the company I was working for bought For Him magazine, which we turned into FHM, selling 35,000 copies. And it had no real character. It was a real mix-up of other magazines. It just didn't have a personality to it. And we developed one of those, and we recognized that in this market, which is growing really quickly because Loaded had launched and Loaded was doing really brilliantly, that actually all the magazines in the market, if you market mapped them, they all sat at the fringes. They were all there for people who didn't really exist. GQ was there for kind of, braces wearing city bankers. Esquire was there for bookish, Galwas smoking, guys with roll necks on. Loaded was for kind of uber, laddish, and they kind of realized if you stick that on the market map, there's this big gap in the middle where nobody is creating a magazine which is inspiring, useful, entertaining, titillating in its own way. And that was what FHM became. And FHM was never as cut through a brand as any of the other men's magazines in the marketplace, but it was a much better product. It was an absolute category killer of a product, because it actually addressed genuine reader needs rather than perceived reader needs. It had the consumer at its heart. So everything that we did for the readers, whereas all the other magazines in the sector did it for themselves. They were obsessed with their own journalism. They were obsessed with their own sense of where they should be. But we knew it was dead easy. It was the easiest, most natural thing to do, was just to go, what is it that our readers are really interested in right now? Let's do loads of that then. And we sold, we ended up selling over 500,000 copies within 2 years.
Wow. So from 35,000 to 500,000.
It was the biggest selling monthly magazine of any kind in Britain. It outsold Cosmo and Good Housekeeping and women's magazines that had, women. The magazine world was largely, prior to that stage, you had general interest magazines for women and you had specialist magazines for men. And FHM basically it was the thing that changed all of that.
Incredible. And what seems so obvious in the rearview mirror is that there was this gaping hole. You talked about market mapping, but what you've just described is the fundamentals of marketing, an unmet need that you can meet much better than others.
And also it was an unarticulated need as well, which made it really powerful. So it was only the articulation of it was the thing that met the need. So the two things together were incredible. And we did this piece of work where we done some research on awareness. This was in the early days of FHM. And what you found was the awareness of most men's magazine brands was really high, but the utility rate was really low, which is almost the worst place to be, right? So it's, everybody knows what GQ is, but nobody reads it. Nobody knew what FHM was, but people were really starting to read and buy it. at that point, you've got an incredible opportunity to build around that.
Yeah. So spotting the opportunity. But I'm going to go back to you said one of your elements of resilience was surrounding yourself with the right people and the right advice. So, I mean, you'll have had some great advice through your career. My question is, what's the piece of advice that has been most valuable that you've passed on to others?
I had a chairman at Shortlist Media called Sir David Arculus, who's a lovely man. And I saw him a few weeks ago for lunch. I still keep in touch with him. And he taught me that businesses are all about momentum. It's very difficult to get momentum into a business in the first place. But once you've got it, it's like the Olympic flame, right? You mustn't let it go out. If you let the momentum slow, you'll never get it back. It's almost impossible. The friction against that. But if you can keep it going, now how do you keep that going? How do you keep momentum going in an organization? It's by innovating. It's by bringing new products and services to market. Is by constantly evolving what you do and continuing to not. My version of that is never get too good at doing what you do. Like, always experiment. Always, when you're creating a product or a service, the fact is it doesn't have to always be 100% brilliant. Like people buy it for the 50% of it that they think is really brilliant. So there's quite a lot of space around there to play and experiment and try new things with. And often organizations lose momentum when they discover the thing that they were absolutely best at, and they then start to target all of their KPIs on finessing that bit. And it takes out of it that joy and the sense of life that you had in the beginning. And it's for media, for example, I think I always say, and whether it was passed down to me or whether I invented it, I don't know now, but I always think that a great media product is something when you know what you're going to get, but you're surprised when you get there. So therefore it has a consistency, but not a formula. So I hate formulas. I hate it when you can see what a formula is in anything, because then they've stopped playing with this. They've stopped experimenting. It's now just a cookie cutter.
I want to perhaps come out to that a little bit. And of course, you clearly created what was a stellar organization in Shortlist Media. And, taking that company from a standing start to a 26 million turnover is no easy feat by any stretch of the imagination. And I wonder if you could maybe describe some of the more challenging moments and perhaps what you learned from those moments as you were scaling that organization.
So Shortlist Media was based on a thesis. And the thesis was that people, we started with men's magazines because it was something that we knew, but readers were moving away from magazines, and part of the reason for that was that they were no longer buying them, they were no longer going into newsagents. The magazines that they were buying, they were not proud of. They felt kind of a bit grubby and a bit exploitative, and so we decided to turn the model of the whole thing on its head. So rather than spend millions of pounds of marketing money to get people to go into a newsagent or to a newsstand within a supermarket and then buy something, we thought, well, we want to have a marketing budget here. What we're going to do is we're going to create a really extraordinary product. Then we're going to hire 800 merchandisers to hand it out outside travel points every Thursday morning. And we're going to get it into people's hands, and we'll soon find out whether they like it or not. And we're going to fund the whole thing with advertising. So we're going to create a product which is high quality, because there's almost no relationship between editorial budget and having good ideas and having really good journalists. That bit, if it's not expensive, in truth, I mean, having good ideas is about your culture. Having good journalists is just choosing the right ones and really looking after them, and therefore great journalism just comes from that. So that's not a massive part of your cost base. The print and paper and production really is. So we had, we had high quality, high volume, so 500,000 copies a week, much bigger than anything else, and then high frequency. So let's do this on a weekly basis. Let's give advertisers and readers, but let's give advertisers a great environment on a weekly basis. And so the theory was great. The first two parts of it were great. The journalism was fantastic. The print and production was really good. The difficulty was actually distributing a free product, which we completely overlooked at the time. So we overlooked the difficulty of the logistics of breaking down 500,000 copies, distributing them, through a kind of a supply chain which we created from scratch, onto the streets, making sure the merchandisers were really there, making sure the merchandisers were really well managed. There were lots of mistakes there, and then learn things, and then educating consumers that they should go towards the man or lady holding out this thing rather than walking around them. I remember walking the streets of London the first day that we came out with this wonderful magazine, and it was like nobody was picking it up. It was like there was an invisible force field around all of our merchandisers, because people were just, I don't know what this is, because we hadn't created awareness in any way, and we hadn't left any room in our budgets to spend money on creating awareness either. So what we had to do was persevere. We had to be there week after week after week. After 2 months, it wasn't a problem anymore. And what had been a problem turned into the most enormous advantage, because our advertisers, who are, of course, just people who work in agencies, would be on public transport and they'd be like, everybody's reading Shortlist. I mean, because that's what would happen. We were in at a time which was just, we're in the early days of smartphones. So, you go into a tube now, nobody's holding any pieces of paper at all. They're just looking at their phones. They're either reading something, they're reading something because the phone's up and down, or they're watching something. They're watching something because they've turned their phone on its side. But in those days, there was still, there was definitely no Wi-Fi underground. There was a real limit to what you could do. And so therefore, we were delivering into that gap. It was excruciatingly difficult to begin with. And if we'd known how difficult it was, we'd never have done it. There's no way we'd have put ourselves through that agony and that pain. There were times where I would be in Birmingham at 6 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday morning in the rain, helping unload bundles of Shortlist into merchandiser trolleys, looking at these very wet merchandisers, thinking, this is what have I done? What have I done? I've remortgaged my house for this. What have I done? Setting that up was so difficult. The benefit of that was, knowing how difficult it was, we knew we had a massive barrier to entry. And, we did a thing which, when we announced what we were doing, we were such insurgents in the marketplace. Nobody had ever tried to do this before. Yes, they'd done it with newspapers before, with Metro across the world and with evening newspapers in London, but nobody had ever tried to do this for magazines before. Every single one of the established publishing companies said this will never work. They said it publicly, they said it loudly. They told all of their advertising customers, don't go anywhere near there, this will never work. They said to all of their staff that they're mad, this will never work. I remember getting calls from kind of concerned ex-colleagues in the industry going, I think it's really brave what you're doing, Mike. And I just want you to know, whatever happens, there will always be a place for you here. I was like, all right, okay, thank you. We're sweeping the floors then. Is that what we're saying?
Well, wow, the agony and the pain of being an insurgent, but how ultimately, if something's easy, then anybody can do it. If it's really, really hard, then it's a source of competitive advantage. Mike, the time has zipped by, so coming to the final question. You use such evocative language and there's so much enthusiasm. So I'm just curious about what are you excited for the future?
Oh, it's a really good question. I'll answer it in two parts. In terms of media and content, I think we're reaching the end of a cycle. I think we're reaching the end of a cycle of the dominance of social, and the dominance of global organizations being the gatekeepers for these things. I'm not saying it's like social won't go away, but I think there have to be new business models which will be developed, which will support great content makers rather than exploit them. And that's ultimately what social does. Social media is a bottom feeder. I mean, it just basically takes everything that other people do, takes their IP, it takes their content, and it distributes it for them. And it's got really greedy about that. It's got really greedy about not sharing the spoils of that. So I suspect there will be other business models which will be created, which will be either distribution networks, which will be a lot more generous, because they're really profitable. So social networks are massively profitable, and wherever there are super profits, they don't last forever. So I think there may be distribution networks which are kind of far more equitable, which will encourage clusters of creativity. And I think there will be new business models which will not rely on advertising, certainly not kind of direct advertising, and which will emerge. And so I'm really looking forward to that. It feels kind of overdue that some of the power comes back to individuals rather than stays with the global giants. So I'm excited about that, because I don't do an awful lot of media work at the moment. The thing I spent most of my career in, I maybe, in terms of my actual kind of working time, takes up less than 5% at the moment. But for me, I'm really excited about continuing to kind of diversify. I've been really lucky that I've been able to use my track record and contacts and everything else, because I am now very old, and be able to find a comfortable place in organizations that I could only have dreamt of being part of when I was younger. Places like the V&A Museum in Dundee, which I'm on the board of, which I'm very proud to be of. Places like the Scottish Rugby Union, where the 12-year-old that used to play rugby in Glenrothes in Fife, I still can't believe it when I walk into Murrayfield for a meeting that I'm involved there. I'm still eager to diversify further. I'm always still looking for other things that I can do, other places where I can learn, other experiences that I can have which are new. I'm addicted to novelty, but not at the expense of the stuff that I do. I mean, I've learned over time how to stay committed to things rather than just move on from them and leave them in the past. So, the things I'm involved in now, I want to continue to be involved in for as long as they'll have me. But I'm also a bit like, there's probably one or two other new things I could do. That'd be great.
Oh, amazing. Addicted to novelty. So, Mike, it's been wonderful to have you on the show, and I know everyone will super appreciate your insights.
Well, Mark, Richie, thank you so much. That I've really, really enjoyed our session today. You've been very generous hosts.